All right, so let's talk.
Yeah. So, if you could just start by introducing yourself, saying a little bit about like where you're from, you can share whatever you want.
Great. So my name is Emmie Arnold. I am from central New Jersey. I grew up in the suburbs with two scientist parents and one older sister. I currently now live in Northeast New Jersey and I commute to New York for work. And I work part-time as a pediatric and palliative care hospital chaplain and now a communications manager for First Presbyterian Church of Glencoe.
Awesome. Thank you. And so I wonder, so for our listeners, what we want to do is to be able to share people's stories of faith and sort of how they change and evolve and show that faith is complicated and complex and doesn't look the same for every person. So could you share with us, how did you come to be a person of faith?
So I was actually an atheist for 20 years, but maybe I would more describe myself as agnostic. I was always curious if there was something out there. I was pretty, I don't want to say superstitious, but I did things like wish on 11/11 and, flip coins and think um, that somehow things would work out, that maybe everything had purpose. But I especially became seeking at ages 18 and 19. I grew up in a pretty, I don't want to say non-religious, because there were a lot of people whose parents would bring them to church or bring them to temple. But I didn't see a lot of joy in faith. Um, Nobody really talked about it in terms of like, oh, this weekend I'm really excited to do this. Occasionally there would be things like mission trips and bat mitzvahs where I'd be like, dang, that would be really cool to have as part of my life. But it would only be sort of like one-off moments where I would be like, I feel like I'm missing something. Um, my mom was intentionally not raised Jewish because her grandparents and some of that generation had fled the Holocaust or lost a lot of people in the Holocaust. And my dad had been raised Catholic, but never went back after his confirmation. And so my parents gave us the options of Catholic Church, Jewish temple, or nothing. And my sister and I picked nothing. And other than those sort of one-off moments, I really didn't feel like I was missing anything. And I honestly felt like religious people were kind of foolish and sort of like, y'all are buying into this like fairy tale. And like, I'm glad it makes you feel better sometimes and that you go and do good things for the community, but I'm not sure if I buy it. And then in college, I went to college down south in Nashville, Tennessee, which is the buckle of the Bible Belt. And I met a bunch of people who were really engaged in their faith. I vividly remember one night I was hanging out with my friends in my dorm room and they said, well, we got to go now. We've got midnight mass. And I said, your parents aren't around anymore. You don't have to do stuff like that. And they said, we like to do stuff like that. I said, oh, interesting. And so I really started like engaging them a little bit, but was sort of still hesitant. I had been raised in an LGBTQ affirming household, and my parents are both scientists, and I felt like faith and science were mutually exclusive. And so I was very hesitant. But here were these like, fellow thinkers and intellectuals who were curious and engaged in their faith. And so I thought maybe they're not so exclusive after all. And there were sort of fits and starts. I'd have conversations that were really moving, and I'd have some conversations that really pushed me away. But when I was 19, I really started noticing that I was having some physical symptoms of illness that I could not identify. And most of the practitioners I went to were like, you're doing fine. Don't worry about it. You're a healthy young woman. Like, you're going to stop feeling this way. And things just got progressively worse. And a lot of the things that had held incredibly dear to me, such as my ability to impress people or my ability to get a perfect GPA and have a perfect resume and be the best friend, the best girlfriend, the best whatever, someone you could always rely on was sort of starting to slip away. I was forgetting things. I was not answering texts in a reasonable amount of time for a 21st century friend. And I was missing classes and falling behind and not remembering things as well. And I was very concerned of just, well, if I'm not this perfect student, perfect employee, perfect friend, perfect girlfriend, perfect daughter, sister, as if there's any such thing as perfect, but I'd really convinced myself that in order to be loved, I needed to be perfect. So if I wasn't these things and I couldn't even pretend to be perfect, was I lovable? And who was I? And I had a really frank conversation with one of my best friends, and I was just basically like, you don't have a 4.0 GPA. How do you look at yourself in the mirror? Like, what is it that gives you identity and purpose? And looking back on it, I'm like, God, I was so rude. But it was just, one of the most like pressing questions to me because she was happy and she did not have a perfect resume or a perfect reputation. She was kind of goofy and fun and just like dearly, perfectly imperfect. And she said, Emmie, one of the ways that I find identity is through Christ. Whatever. And I was just so curious. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And she was like, well, in Christ, I cannot gain or lose value. I cannot be any more or less lovable than I am in this moment. And in Christ, I have my value. And in Christ, I have my purpose and my sense of belonging. And the rest of it falls into place. And I was really moved by that. And thus began about 7 months of engaged and disengaged exploring and curiosity. I actually became a prospective member in a Christian sorority for the first time as their like seeker member. They had never had a non-Christian, non-baptized young woman want to join this sorority. And they were just like, wow, this is so interesting. And there were many moments where it was brilliant. And then I had moments that pushed me away. And part of it was that my partner was an atheist, my family, strongly agnostic, very curious, very like, sort of like God is in the trees, God is in what's around us, God is in science, but no formal anything. Very open-minded, but very like, we're rational people. And so I acted like a Christian around Christians and an atheist around atheists. And I felt like such a fraud everywhere I went. Mm. And I was so very confused. And then on September 1st, 2013, I went to church. And it was probably, the 10th time I had gone to church. And I went with one of my friends, and the sermon, it was this mega church in Nashville, Tennessee. And so it's this like dimly lit concert hall, like everything you can imagine of like a mega church. One of those like intentionally, we're not an old church building. We don't read written prayers. We are like alive in the spirit churches that I will always hold dear because of this moment and so many other formative moments. It was where I was baptized, etc. But September 1st, 2013, the passage was from Nehemiah, and it's about how Nehemiah was living a very cushy life as a cupbearer to the king, and he hears about trouble in Jerusalem, and he rips his clothes, and it's just heartbroken about what's going on, and he requests permission to leave. And not only does the king give him permission, he gives him, fortification, people who will help him get there safely. And he gets there and people are just in tatters, and the wall, the bricks are just everywhere, right? It's just like people do not know how to rebuild. And Nehemiah feels called to help people rebuild. And all of a sudden I heard a voice, like, and sort of coming from the sky. And it was a voice, that I had never heard before. It was a different tone. It was a different, it just, it was different. And it said, "You are called to be like Nehemiah and to help people build when they feel like they have nothing left. Leave your cushy life and go." And I've never looked back. And that was 7.5 years ago at this point. And now I work as a minister. Um, and it's just been a whirlwind, an absolute whirlwind. And I'm so grateful for the different ways that the evangelical Christian community helped me get in, and the more liberal communities that I've joined since, and working as a hospital chaplain and realizing that things are so different from black and white. The like very simple answers that I had gotten in my first church have sort of, fallen away as I've faced more and more suffering, including my own. And just seeing how it has progressed and changed and deconstructed and reconstructed and then deconstructed again, basically every day that I exist in a COVID world, every day that I exist in this body that has symptoms and challenges, and every day that I face this world, I'm so grateful for the different communities that have formed this faith, and all of the days in between when God has spoken or remained silent, in which I have felt the Spirit and not felt the Spirit, and all the different people who have spoken and left things unsaid alongside me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like there's so much there, right? Like, I mean, for one thing, you talk about that experience of sort of having a sense of identity, losing a sense of identity at a time that's really crucial to find a sense of identity, right? Going to college, being away from your family, especially going from New Jersey to Tennessee, right? That's already a culture shock. I did the opposite. I'm from the South and went up north. Um, and I think, just hearing about how, your parents were not people who were foreign to faith, right? It sounds like they had some experience with what a faith community was, at least, or, like knew about it and knew that they had other family who had faith identities, even if they chose not to take on those identities. So it's like there's
Mhm.
this heritage there that sort of like stops, right?
Yeah,
And then you're aware of that and you had an option, you had a choice, right? Do you want to choose one of these heritages or do you want to go your own way? And you and your sister choose to go your own way. And then here you are, though, in college, right? And how you've defined yourself, you're no longer able to do that in the same way you were. So I can imagine that's like you're having to shift how you like shape your own sense of self. Right?
truly. It was very strange, um, being offered these different identities, but very tentatively. My entire mother's family had become atheist. People who still practiced Judaism were seen as outcasts in their family,
Mm,
because they had escaped or not escaped the Holocaust. And so I didn't learn about my Jewish heritage until I was in Israel and Palestine, basically,
wow.
as part of a class in seminary, and realizing how much anti Judaism there is accidentally and intentionally built into Christianity and Christian
Mhm.
circles,
Right.
and just sort of having to reconcile, like, what does it mean to know that I could have embraced a Jewish identity, embraced a Catholic identity, but like I wasn't given all the information. And how do I bring that in now? And so now I call myself like a Christian with ever strengthening Jewish roots. And that's been fascinating because in some ways I'm sort of going out on my own. And in some ways I'm trying to bring my mom with me as I
Mhm.
explore, this Jewish piece of myself because she wasn't given all the pieces. That part of my family sort of chucked history. And
Mhm.
I can't say I would have done it better or differently. Um, and now I'm dating a Catholic, and so it's interesting because I have all these different pieces. And as we consider, what it will be like to raise our children someday in a Protestant, Catholic, Jewish household, um, it's been fascinating to sort of pick up these pieces and to add some context to them that maybe even my parents didn't have, um, and just sort of bring them along in a way. Um, and to, with their deep support, explore my own um, new roots. It's been such an interesting identity formation. And you're completely right. It was such a formative time, and I felt like everything was falling apart. And I'm grateful that things fell apart because the identity that I had discovered, sort of built coming out of a town where achievement was so important. Everyone wanted to go to Princeton and Harvard and Columbia, and a lot of my classmates got in. And I went to Vanderbilt because it was the highest ranked school I got into. Um, and just it was a really toxic identity to take on because if you don't achieve, then who are you? What's your purpose in life? If you're not great at everything you ever set your hands on, if you don't have 5 side hustles,
Mhm.
what's your purpose? And so just really letting go of that toxic sense of self as doer and embracing a sense of self as inherently worthy, inherently lovable, regardless of how much I do and do not do. Because I'm very fortunate. Some people with the illnesses I eventually got diagnosed with don't work at all because their symptoms are disabling. Um, I work part time in order to take care of my health. And that was a grieving process from the 18-year-old self who thought that achievement was everything. Um, and I'm very grateful to have let go of the deepest parts of that. And it's still something every day that I'm letting go of, but taking on that sense of identity as something that God gives and cannot be taken away.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot there around identity, right? And how we form identity. How do religious spaces give us identity? And I think it's interesting too that you sort of found this Christian identity in the South, right? Where it's such a cultural norm, right? And that
Hmm.
language is so deeply embedded in the culture. Like it's it's interesting to think about like, well, what would have happened if you were in a different context, right? Like, what if you were in a context that was predominantly Jewish? How would that have informed things?
Yeah. What if I had gone to my dream college, which was largely agnostic?
Yeah, right, right.
It's absolutely fascinating to me to consider these different things, because I'm the worst kind of Jew, right? I'm a Christian. And so, what if I had been formed in a Jewish community? What if I had been surrounded by agnostics in college? What if I had been mainly surrounded by Catholics rather than Protestants, evangelical Protestants in particular? It's such an interesting set of forks in the road. And I'm very grateful that even though I have left the evangelical church due to things like evangelizing to Jewish people and not affirming and celebrating LGBTQ identity, um, and an intense focus on evangelism and heaven and hell. Even though I've left that, I am so grateful for the intense focus on evangelism that got me in, right? My friends were worried for my soul. And I mean, I was worried for my own self. I wouldn't use the same language of like worried about my eternal destiny, but I was certainly worried about where I was because it was
Mm,
very, very much built on sand and it was starting to get washed away.
right. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting piece in and of itself, right? That all of us, in some ways, have like things that are built on sand, right? We all have these parts of ourselves that we may think they're secure until we learn at some point, right? You just happen to have something that pushed you into recognizing the insecurity of it earlier than others might. And
Yeah.
then I think based on our social location, based on physical abilities, based on our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our sexual orientation, right? All of these things, we all come up against where that sand is in our lives at different times. Right?
Yeah.
And it forces us to say, well, who am I? How will I stand? On what can I stand? And
Yeah.
it's so interesting too to me that right that Nehemiah then becomes for you this touchstone, right? This person, this character, right? This, person that God called then becomes a touchstone for you to say, like, you needed to be built up too, right? And so and
Mhm.
that resonates with you, and then you can then offer that to others. Which I think
Exactly.
again says something about the way that the things that we often do are the very things that we need.
Mhm. Absolutely. I think one of the reasons that I love serving as a hospital chaplain so much is I needed a chaplain at
Mm,
my doctor's appointments when people were telling me nothing's wrong with you,
mm,
or when people were saying things, but in ways that were unhelpful that left me reeling. Um, I needed someone like who I now serve as. And thankfully, I've had lots of people along the way step in, whether they were therapists or friends or my mama, who is like a fierce, fierce advocate of me. When a doctor accused me of drug seeking, there was nothing like my mother. There was no one like my mother to step in and say, "You have no idea who this young woman is, and how dare you?" And I just, so people stepped in, and yet I am so grateful now to be one of those people who gets to step in and, sit by someone who is looking at their bricks and trying to figure out what wall to build. Um, and that instance with God not only set me on a path of becoming a person of faith, but also knowing for sure that I was heading in the correct direction because I knew I wanted to work in the medical field somewhere. And at that point, I had sort of eliminated doctor because even though I love science and I'm good at it, I'm the daughter of two researchers, one of whom is now researching antiviral treatments for COVID. I'm so proud of him and grateful for him. I love science, but I knew I wanted to be more on the people side of things rather than the diagnostics. Um, so I knew I wanted to work with people who were ill, but this really sort of clarified like you're headed in the correct direction with like stories and conversation and helping people identify their bricks and figure out what they want to build up to. I love welcoming people into meaning making and inviting them into a space of looking at their bricks and saying, well, what do I build now? Everything I knew fell apart when I got, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or my loved one is dying or I have this very complicated mental illness that I'm struggling with. And I may struggle with it for the rest of my life. And what do I do with this? Um, and so it is funny. We often serve in roles that we needed. And I'm so grateful that I get to serve in this role that I consider very sacred, and a role that various people have filled without ever having the title of hospital chaplain in my life. Um, it's such a it's a role that I never take for granted.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said too for your own, the way that you were able to name for yourself those needs, right? Like if you were to just repress those needs or push them aside somehow, right? To sort of not acknowledge them, I wonder how that would have manifested, right? Like for you, you've been able to sort of take hold of them and say like, no, these are my needs, and then you're able to recognize those needs in others, it sounds like, because you have done the work to name them for yourself.
Yeah, and it's a daily process, right? For any of the listeners who are interested in Enneagram things, I am a very strong 2, wing 3. I like to look like I have it together. I love to be the helper, and
Mhm.
God help you if you want to help me, right? Like, I'm good. Like, no, 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 no.
Mhm.
It's you who, like, let me serve you. I'm fine. Like, I'm good. I need nothing from you. And it's been a 9 or 10 year process of learning to name my needs and not despise having needs, not to be angry that I have needs, and sometimes different needs from people my age, due to my illness, different needs for different accommodations, and different needs for a different body, a different location, a different, we all have different needs from each other, and it's important to name them and to
Mhm.
welcome them, because if I am someone who is bitter when needing help, what does that say about how I view the people who I help?
Mhm.
um, and so learning to name and not despise my needs, and to despise myself for having needs, has been very it's a daily battle, that my loved ones know that when I ask for something, it's because I really, really need it. And they try to get me to speak up earlier. And I'm grateful for the ways that I have learned that I bear the Imago Dei, the image of God, even when I need more than I can give, and even when I cannot give nearly anything.
Mhm.
Even on the days when I show up to work and I feel like I'm giving 20% of my max capacity, even on days when I feel like I'm just slogging through and not really adding much to the world. Um, I still matter on those days, and I still am a person who can allow myself to be a person on those days, and to accept having needs and name them, and trust that people will help me to meet them.
Mhm.
Because when I was hiding from all my needs, when I did ask for something, I didn't have people who
Mhm.
were waiting in the wings, because I had told everyone I need nothing.
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
And so allowing my loved ones to know that I am struggling, or that I need help with physical tasks that not every 27-year-old needs help with. Laundry is very difficult for me because of all the bending and lifting. And so just, rearranging what household tasks my partner and I do in order to honor that. And knowing that it might not be an even 50-50 split,
Mhm. Mhm.
and grieving that, and understanding that I'm lovable and a good partner, even if it's not a perfect balance. We're not sitting there measuring the scales of like who has done more hours of household tasks. If it were like 10 versus 0, like, okay, we should probably sit down and look at the scales. But like, naming needs and allowing myself to have them, and naming needs that I see in my patients and allowing them to have them, and saying, you don't need to be thinking about household tasks right now. You're in this hospital bed. Can you let yourself just be here?
Yeah. Right. Well, I am also an Enneagram too. So I can totally connect to all of that. I mean, certainly to the concept of the idea of having needs as being terrifying and communicating them way too late, not wanting to even acknowledge that they exist, right? And wanting to always be the ever present help.
I'm learning
Yeah.
to say no
Yep.
to helping and yes to being helped.
Yep. It is so hard.
What a journey.
Hmm. Right.
One that is worthy of undertaking.
Yes. Absolutely. And I wonder, like in hearing you talk about that, I wonder how does that play out in the way that you think about God's role in your life?
One of the names that I love for God that we see in the Bible, a lot of times when people are looking at Adam and Eve as a very black and white story of roles and,
Mhm.
of gender roles, of tasks in life, of who sinned first and what does
Right.
that mean? Eve is described as a helper.
Mhm.
And some people see that as like, sort of like Adam's underling. And, she's there to serve him and that's it. But God also is described as a helper in the Bible, in the same word.
Mhm.
And it is so beautiful for me to see God as a helper, as the psalmist saw God, of like, God is the one who hears my cry and does something about it, who outstretches God's hand and responds. God's hand is different from the enemy's hand. The enemy's hand uses violence, and God's hand uses compassion. And God's hand bears scars. And just knowing that God is a wounded healer, that God is in the business of compassion and mercy and transformation, I think is just one of the most remarkable things about God. I much more relate to these images of God, sitting alongside people than like God on the throne, God as the Almighty, the all powerful, the all knowing. Um, those are important images as I think about how the world turns and how the world is turning upside down, and it will eventually be justice everywhere. Um, but I love the images of God as the one who hears, the one who sees, the one who holds out a hand
Mhm.
and is with people tenderly. I love the feminine images of God in the Bible, of God as the mother hen sheltering people under her wings. Um, and so I try to pass those images along to my patients, and I try to hold those images dear for my own understanding of God and what it means to be a person of faith on my own, and what it means to be a person of faith in relationship to other people, to act with tenderness, even as you act boldly and flip tables and, um, you know, help turn the world upside down so that it's right side up again. There's a tenderness that lies underneath it, this helper, this compassion, this care. Yeah, those are
Yeah.
some of the images of God that I cherish the most.
Mhm. And in that, I hear room for different roles, like for us to be imitators of God in different ways, right? Like there are the helpers and there are the table flippers. And it's okay that we're not always the same people, right? I think one of the things that I often hear from people is this concept of God as one way, and then we're supposed to be or should be uh, one way also, right? Like
Mhm.
I grew up certainly with that Southern culture, the Southern mindset of, like, don't be ugly, meaning like, don't be mean, like,
Mhm.
always be nice to people. Right. And I think that the being nice and helping are not the same thing, right? Niceness and compassion are not the same thing.
Mm-mm.
And I think there's certainly overlaps and there's times when they are the same thing, but there's also times when they're not. And I think, there's this for me, I think I really want people to know that there's freedom of expression, right? That there's this, even within God, there's this complexity and diversity. And I mean, who are we even to be able to define God completely, right? We're just looking at pieces and saying, this is what I see, but I recognize there's no possible way that I could see the whole thing. I am like God taking, a little cup and taking some water out of the ocean, and that's me, right? Like, there's
Yep.
no way I could name the whole ocean that is God, but
No.
I can name the ocean that is within my cup, and I
Mhm.
can honor that. And I can also learn to honor the ocean that's in other people's cup, right? And say, like, I see this aspect of God within you, right?
Mhm.
And I think, it's sort of something that I hear in what you're sharing, even about the way that you conceptualize God and recognizing the diversity of images for God, but also how you connect.
Mm.
Yeah. So, one other thing that I was thinking about as you shared is, you talked about moving from like evangelical church spaces to more liberal spaces. And I wonder if you could just share a little bit about what that process was like in change, and where are you landing with things now? You talked about an ongoing deconstruction and reconstruction.
Yep. So these days, I'm now in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'm very close to completing the ordination process, God willing, and God be praised for that. I knew that evangelical spaces were getting a little bit too tight for me um, around the time of the 2016 election.
Hmm.
And at that time, I was at a multi ethnic, multicultural church, just about as good as any evangelical church community can get. And I will always love the time that I got to spend with them. I learned so much about what it means to be a neighbor. They were very focused on neighborhoods and living as a Christian with your neighbors, not just hypothetically, but like knowing your neighbors, signing petitions in your neighborhood, being the one walking around with a clipboard in your neighborhood, showing up to town council meetings. You know, a lot of people donated their stimulus check to mutual aid organizations in their neighborhood. And I love that church still. I'm friends with a lot of the people, and I have so much love for the minister. He was by far the best evangelical minister I know. Someone who's really willing to stand in the gaps, even as someone who's, pro-life and very, very concerned about salvation and, you know, very much part of like the third way for the LGBTQ community of like embracing them in the church as people, but also calling for celibacy. Um,
Yeah.
there's a few things that he and I just like fundamentally could not come together on, but I have so much love for him. And I know that the vast majority of my church did not vote for Donald Trump because they just found his behavior, especially toward the stranger and the immigrant, they found it abhorrent. um, and so I know that my church did about as well as any evangelical church during the 2016 election. But it was very much a reminder of like, people wish I were not in this space. People do not
Mm.
want me here in the fullness of my identity as someone who proudly considers myself a feminist and who proudly considers myself a part of the queer community, regardless of who I'm dating. Um, as someone who proudly is starting to embrace like Jewish roots and understanding the problematic relationship that Christians have had with Jews since day one. Um, Problematic being like a huge euphemism for things that are far more sinister. Um, But the 2016 election, with 81% of white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump, I just remembered that my multi-ethnic, multicultural church was an anomaly. And that if I went to a different city, chances are I wouldn't find anywhere like it. And so I thought, maybe this is the time to start looking. And I was at a Presbyterian seminary, and I had been going to a Presbyterian Sunday night worship group. And I very much consider Presbyterians like the Hufflepuffs of Christians. They're like very loyal, very sweet. We've also got some Ravenclaw qualities of like being very intellectual and being a little bit like hard-headed about like doctrine and things. But I felt very connected there. And I went to a church in a town nearby mine, just to check it out. I thought I would church hop a little bit. And the sermon was about reconciliation work in Israel and Palestine. And I said, I belong here. And that's the church that I'm under care of to this day. And, you know, it was a very long few months of feeling in spiritual exile, because the election happened in November of 2016, and I found the church in February of 2017. So there were a few long months of lament and loss. I remember just sobbing in our seminary's chapel service the day after the election, just weeping, just being like, where do I belong? My fellow evangelicals in seminary voted against me. And I fit in with this other crowd, and I think I should go. And I definitely miss some aspects of the evangelical church, and I bear some of the marks of the evangelical church, I think, in good ways. One of the best things for me as a hospital chaplain is getting to pray for people. And I have that evangelical ability to pray off the cuff, because that was something that was so emphasized. We don't read written prayers. We focus on the spirit. Spirit is not written down. Spirit comes from here. And people still are like, wow, you're so good at praying. I'm just like, praise be to God for the evangelical church. Right. And, I still bear the marks of that multi-ethnic, multicultural church that I was at, because I'm so interested in what's going on in my neighborhood. Even though I don't know my neighborhood well right now, because I moved here during COVID, just trying to keep up with what's going on here. What's the Mutual Aid Society up to? What is the town council talking about? How can I love my neighborhood? How can I ethically spend my money in my neighborhood? How can I be a positive impact, even though I don't know nearly anybody right now? And so that 3 months in between knowing that I had to leave my evangelical church and doing it really badly, I did it over email, and it was really tactless, and I feel terrible about it to this day. And I've apologized to my pastor, and gracefully he forgave me. But it was a very long 3 months. And these days I'm pretty attached to Presbyterian doctrine. I love that it's both very orthodox and also very open to what the Spirit is doing now. I wanted a church that bore marks of history, because again, I sort of inherited these ahistorical identities from my parents and had to piece things together. And I love that the Presbyterian church has things very laid out in documents, to a point where I'm like, ooh, too many documents, too much layout, too many charts, too much. But I love that we can easily look up where we come from, and that it's an affirming denomination, and that it's the denomination that ordains women. I forgot to mention that. It's another reason that I needed to leave the evangelical church, because I felt called to serve as a minister.
Right.
And I mean, there are evangelical hospital chaplains. Hospital chaplains aren't, part of the only a man should be preaching the sermon. Like, female hospital chaplains are not unusual, but needed to leave. And these days, I have so many encounters with faith outside the church because of my job and because of what I see. I see terrible things and I see beautiful things. And so every day it's sort of like I go to work, I think I know what I believe, things fall apart, things sometimes fall back together. Sometimes they fall more apart than they do together. Today is one of those days where I'm just like exhausted by the amount of suffering I saw yesterday. And just sort of like, God, where were you? Where were you in that? And just a daily, like, sitting in grief and wondering, okay, God, where are you? What does this all mean? And will I get answers on this side of the curtain? Will I get any answers? Just like a little bit. But my patients don't want answers. Nobody looks at me and says, please talk to me about John Calvin's doctrine of suffering. I have never had a patient who cared where I went to seminary. I've never had a patient who cared what my GPA was or how good I was at church history. Never had a patient who asks me about, Presbyterian doctrine. They ask questions and look for answers, but they wouldn't want my answers. They want to figure out their own. And so when they say, what is happening? They don't want me to sit there and say what I think is happening. They want me to acknowledge that they have no idea what is happening. And I can reflect back at them some things that I see and observe, but they want their own. And so being part of people's deconstruction and reconstruction on a daily basis, I've got these thousands of stories that I now hold of deconstruction and reconstruction. And because hospital chaplaincy is such a crisis-focused ministry, if I'm lucky, I see a patient 3 times. Now that I work in the pediatric intensive care unit and with palliative care, I do often see people a lot more often. But, sometimes I'm only with someone once. So I'm really only part of deconstruction and looking around at the bricks. And it definitely affects my own bricks and my own sense of how formed faith can be on this side of the curtain. So it's daily. I'm grateful to only work part-time as a hospital chaplain so that I've got more days than not to sit in my own faith and to consider what it means in my own little world and in my own little cup from the ocean, right? Of what this all means. And I just am so grateful for the ways that my patients' faith and falling out of faith impacts my own. And yet I'm grateful to have my own sense, my own cup of what it means to be a person of faith, what it means to be Emmie, what it means to be Emmie in relationship to the people I love, the church that I'm a part of, even during COVID when we're apart, what it means. It's exhausting and beautiful all at once.
Yeah. And it even, I hear in that a connection to where you started, right? With talking about an achievement focused sense of self, right? That in this world that you're in now, what does achievement even mean? Right? Because if you try to achieve by having like, oh, well, these are my credentials, this is the answer that I have to give, right? It means nothing in that world, you're saying.
No,
And
they
it's
do
like,
not care.
right, right.
And it's beautiful that they don't care. Because you're right, it is a continued, like, they do not care that I graduated magna cum laude. They don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And as I watch them not care, I'm able to let go of that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And to be like,
Yeah.
what they care about is who I am as a person. Am I listening to them? Am I taking their cues of whether they want eye contact or not? Am
Mm.
I giving them expression? God, I get headaches sometimes because, I'm wearing my mask and I only have this part of my face and
Right.
my body language to show that I care. And so there's
Mhm.
so much work that's done with my eyebrows these days, right? And so I end up with headaches and I'm just like, but it's me trying to show that I care and that I'm
Uh,
listening. They don't care about my achievements. They care about what they see in my eyes if they want to do eye contact. They care that I am mirroring what they're showing me. That I don't show
mhm.
up in a dress covered in sunflowers and say, hey, how's everything going today?
Right.
Like, they think if I show up like that, they think I've never suffered
Mm.
and that I can't be with them in theirs. They want to see my eyes get a little watery when they're telling the worst of their stories. And they do not care about my achievements.
Yeah.
It's beautiful because it's just so human to human. If they're willing to take off the facade that they have worn, it is so human to human.
Mhm.
And people often say, I've never told anyone this, or I've never really had to sit down and think about this, or, you know, this is as honest as I've been in years. Just like, yes, yes, more of this, please.
Mhm.
Right? Like, this is what I want. This is what I want for you. Well, I love my work. And you're so right. And they're not caring about my achievements. I get to let go of that. When people appreciate me there, it's not because I had a good cover letter and got my job.
Mhm.
Obviously, the achievements mattered. I wouldn't have my job had I not had a good resume, had I not done what I needed to do and got the sparkly stickers and, the letters of recommendation. But now that I'm there, we can let that go and we can just be.
Right.
And my coworkers are so wonderful. I worked as a solo chaplain for 7 months when I first got out of my residency, and it was very, very hard because there wasn't anyone around me who could fully understand what I was doing. Um, and there wasn't that sense of solidarity that's needed for this sort of role. And now I have two chaplain colleagues, and one of them is so focused on like, nobody cares about the number of patients you see in a day, right? Don't see one patient, but like, just go and have deep interactions with them and play with them. I work with kids. Sometimes I'm
Mhm.
playing Uno, and that's
Right.
a way that we like start the connection, right? We're being goofy, we're laughing together. I'm like, I just kicked your butt at Uno. And ha, right? A
Mhm.
minister just kick your butt. And they want someone there. And I love that I get to do that. Mm,
Mhm.
I love it. And then I also love getting to do communications work and a little bit more like to-do tasks that I get to cross off and say, well, thank God, I scheduled the social media post, it's done, right?
Right.
It's very like, I did the task got done in a way that chaplaincy is just not. And so it's really nice to be able to split my time in that way, my working hours in those ways.
Mhm. Yeah, you get to have that balance of like, well, there are still like achievements in some way, right? You get to check things off the list and say achieved, right?
Yes, indeed.
Mhm. But it's not the overall sense of self anymore. It's not the center place.
No. And thanks be to God for that.
Mhm.
And so, any of y'all listening out there who can relate to this sense of I am what I do, I really encourage you to look around at what you've had to face this last year. Many people have lost their jobs and
Mhm.
been faced with this just head on of who am I if not a large events planner, a musician, uh, you know, Broadway actor, um, someone who works in an office and does meetings with people in person. Um, I encourage you, if you haven't had to face that head on, to face it anyway,
Mm.
to look at what am I? Who am I besides what I do? That's part of the reason that I say I serve as a hospital chaplain. I never say anymore I am a hospital chaplain.
Mm.
Like,
Mhm.
yes, my characteristics match it, right? Like who I am as a person matches the role because I wouldn't be able to do the role if I didn't have these personality traits. Um, but I work really, really hard to be like, this is what I do from 10 to 6. And when I go home, this is who I am. I am a, I am a person at home. I
Mhm.
am not an entirely different person, right? I can't just like split my identity in half.
Right.
We're more complex than that. But um, I am so much more than what
Right.
I do. And so are you, Lance. And so are any of you out there listening. You just, if you haven't had to face it head on this year, if it hasn't hit you like a bunch of bricks, invite a little bit of it.
Mm.
Invite a little bit of it to do that, to separate it, to see who you are besides your jobs, besides your relationships to other people. Like, who are you when you're not a mom or a teacher or this or that? Who are you? And
Right.
who does God say you are?
Mhm.
And be moved by what you find, because you will find beautiful things.
Amen. Yeah. It's finding those touchstones, right? Like your Nehemiah. What is the solid ground that we can stand on? When all is said and done, when everything else fails, when everything is gone, where will we stand?
Amen.
Well, with that, Emmy, would you like to pray us out?
I would love to. Here we go with that good evangelical background, right? Oh, man. Again, thanks be to God for the different places I've gone, even the ones that I've left.
Mhm.
God who comes to us in words and in silence. God who comes to us in actions and in moments where we don't know what's going on. God who is tender and God who flips tables. Be with us as we explore who we are on a daily basis and explore what it means to be a person of faith, whether we are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or anything, or just a little bit of everything in between. Lord, I thank you for all the different people who each of us have come across, who are part of our journey of faith, whether they are still walking this path with us or not. We thank you for the different communities that we have been part of throughout our lives, even the communities we've left. I pray for all listeners who have had different communities along the way who have hurt them, and different people along the way who have hurt them, different moments with God that have hurt, and different moments with themselves that have hurt, that they will feel healing and care and peace. I pray for all people who've listened that they would feel a sense of connection, knowing that they're not the only ones who have ever searched for identity and belonging and an understanding of God that's bigger than the little cup in the ocean that each of us can hold. And I thank you, God, that you are bigger than the cup that we can hold, that you are so much more than we can understand or imagine. that you are who you are, that your character does not change, and yet the world around us and the different ways that you show up in it changes. And so thank you for transforming right alongside us. And I pray for continued transformation and healing during this time that is so painful for so many different reasons. Lord, as we hit the anniversary of COVID and just massive trauma as a country and as a world, I pray that you would bring peace and care and a sense of hope to people, to know that this is not the end of the story, even on this side of the curtain, that there will be better months ahead and better years ahead. And for anyone who is in the middle of searching for identity, that there are better months and years ahead. Lord, I thank you for opportunities to connect. And I thank you for Glenwood Table and the ways that Pastor Lance seeks to invite people into this sense of exploration and curiosity. And I pray that this ministry will flourish and that we will all become more curious and imaginative and engaged in our own journeys of faith, day in and day out. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Emmie.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was great. It was my pleasure. All right, I'm gonna stop the recording.